Business Monday always brought to you in partnership with Deepwater Wind. Our friends at Deepwater Wind are kind of reinventing energy, not just in Rhode Island, but across the country. They've got big projects going on in Long Island that's gotten a bunch of write-ups in the New York Times, and now in Massachusetts, been a couple big pieces in the Boston Globe recently. Last week was hard to believe, a chaotic budget session. That came out, the week is a blur to me. I think it came out Thursday night went to House Finance at...
Friday morning.
Yeah, right. Went Thursday night and came out Friday morning. Give your overview on the budget.
Well, you make better decisions at midnight, 1 o'clock than you do at 9 or 10 because you're awake. I was thinking about this, and I probably could have given you the same analysis 10 years ago. There's a lot of deja vu in this budget. There's a lot of business as usual. I think there are about 3 or 4 observations I would make. First, they had a constitutional responsibility to close the budget gap, and at least on paper present a balanced budget, and they did so through a mixture of spending cuts and one-time revenues. Some of the spending cuts were not identified. It was about $25 million in spending cuts that the governor will be responsible for finding. And the one-time revenues are one-time, so they won't reoccur. The second point I would make is that there were some major changes in the budget, and they were changes that you'd expect. The speaker's car tax was included.
Sure.
The governor got a fraction of what she had asked for on...
About 1/10, functionally.
But in terms of dollars, I think in terms of policy, it was closer to the right choice, though. I think the legislature should be commended because there's experience in just a handful of other states of free tuition in the community college, and there's still a lot of questions. It's not needs tested. There's a question about the capacity of the community college and their quality issues. But it's, I think, a better policy choice than what she had originally proposed. Well, also, even though some of the left protest, the legislature was responsive. They pared back some of the cuts in Medicaid, particularly for nursing homes. They increased the minimum wage. They left money in, additional money to make English learners whole. That was temporary in the previous year. So there were some policy changes in the budget, and some of them were not insignificant, and they're going to have future impacts. And then the third observation I would make, it kind of seems to me, and it's early because I haven't read all those summary sheets, that they're kicking the can down the hill. In the first place, I really doubt if the current year budget is balanced. When you use one-time revenue and your operating expenditures exceed your operating revenue, then that's a definition of a structural deficit. And I suspect when we get behind the numbers, we may find one. The out-year deficits, it's interesting. The House Fiscal Advisory Staff, nor anyone else that I'm aware of, has published a projection of out-year deficits. When the governor submitted her budget, there was a $190 million out-year deficit in the out years of the budget. I wouldn't be surprised if that number increases because of the funding of the car tax, which wasn't an obligation before, and also the use of one-time revenue. And that means we're just going to, we're just in limbo. We have a deficit that's not serious enough to make you focus on fundamental structural reforms, but it's enough to stop you from doing things that you might otherwise want to do, whether it's cutting taxes or investing.
Well, and aren't we ignoring that there's going to be significant changes no matter how we plan on the federal side? We're going to have less federal dollars in all likelihood than we had the previous year.
Absolutely, and we don't know what changes are going to come in Obamacare, how it's going to affect Medicaid. A lot of other states, will absorb the cuts by changing policy. The kind of reaction here thus far, particularly in the Senate, saying we're going to guarantee the same coverage under Obamacare with less, federal money. That's going to be very difficult. So when I said we put ourselves in limbo by having structural deficits and by having out-year red ink as far as you can see, that means we have less room for error. And changes in federal level support most likely going to happen, and that's going to really create some interesting choices.
Could we have a perfect storm next year going into a big election year?
Well, I've always looked for the perfect storm, and the only really perfect storms. There are two perfect storms I've seen in 40 years. One was the banking crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the second was the Great Recession that no state was really
Yeah.
prepared for. Those were whackers.
Right.
Those are perfect storms. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, and it's hard to project that it will, because I don't think the economy is going to fall back. I think even though the economy is not going to be going on all 8 cylinders, it'll be going on 6 cylinders. Everyone's forecast have at least 2% growth. So we're not going to get that economic shock. The shock we're going to get is a fiscal shock, depending on what happens with the federal government. And that shock may not hit us in 19, it may hit us in 20. So it's hard to say, but again, we've spent every penny we could find. We put ourselves in a structural deficit situation. We left no room for any potential contingencies. And that's been the story around here for a number of years.
Yeah. And the ramifications are potentially quite serious, that we do lose, a few $100 million from the federal pass-throughs, and the economy dips or stays even the same. I mean, we don't have much job growth, and we don't have much economic growth. It's kind of barely slow and steady right now. We got job report numbers for May. It was the first time we added jobs in 3 months. And so, for Governor Raimondo, it creates a very tough balancing situation for her.
Well, I think when you look at the growth here compared to Massachusetts and the country, I was looking at those figures just today. For the period of time that Governor Raimondo has been in office, our employment grew by about 2.5%.
Yeah.
It was close to 6% in Massachusetts, and nationally it was well over 3.5%. So, there are other states that are outperforming us, and this is a psychological observation I'm going to make. We've got to be careful about building up false expectations. Every time you hear a press release come out of the governor's office, company X is coming here, 80 jobs, and we've got 15 new companies, but there's still an economy, the much bigger economy, and we need to be a little bit realistic about where our economy is and how quickly it's growing.
So we had a piece today on Commerce Corporation. We had a piece on Saturday about the cuts to Commerce Corporation, but the one today was about, over the past 2 years, they've let out about $12 million in third-party contracts, everything from Volvo race porta-johns to contracts with any number of about 100 consultants. And according to our analysis of about 136 different contractors, the vast majority of the dollars went out of state. If you look at, it was about $8 million to about $4 million roughly. It was about 2 to 1. And when you see those numbers, is that a missed opportunity to create some jobs in Rhode Island?
Yeah, the Commerce Corporation is a real enigma to me, and as you know, for the last year or so, I've been very concerned and very critical.
You've been rather vehement.
Yeah, some on ideological grounds, because I question what we're buying for corporate welfare, and whether or not we need to give people money to build hotels if the whole market will support hotels. So putting philosophical concerns aside, the bigger issue, and I blame the legislature for this, because when the legislature enacted the law creating the Commerce Corporation, they really gave it carte blanche. They really, for a number of years, didn't exercise effective oversight. And what's coming to light, in answer to your question, because I don't know the details and don't know what the options were, is there's a real question of the transparency and the accountability of how that agency operates. We need a full, independent, hopefully legislative oversight to answer the questions of how is the corporation picking winners and losers, spending tens of millions of dollars picking winners and losers, and we pick 4 hotels.
Right.
What's the predicate of that decision? What's the return on investment? We need to also learn more about what salaries they pay, how many people work there, how their salaries compare to other senior state managers.
Sure.
These are not brain surgeons. They're doing economic development.
Yeah, sure.
And so we need to look at that. And then finally, we got to look at their procurement practices because of the questions that you raised. And so I think it all falls into one big bushel, and that bushel is a thorough, comprehensive review of the points that I just made to find out what this agency is all about. Because, you know, we criticize the EDC, and if anything, some of the criticism of the EDC was that we underinvested in the EDC.
Sure.
Well, we did invest. We made that world's worst decision
Yeah, right.
with 38 studios, and we've given this agency a lot more money and don't do with the same amount of accountability and transparency. Right. And I'm just very concerned that we're not creating an EDC on steroids.
One of the things that came out of the budget was some trim backs on the Rebuild Rhode Island from what the governor asked for. To date, about $150 million of rebuild has been approved. 83 million of that has been obligated to one project or another. But now, after about 2.5 years, there's not a lot of shovels in the ground. Are we going to see that program actually create some jobs? And what's the timeline on it?
And what kind of jobs? Because, you know, your publication is written about the Wexford project.
Yeah.
You know, where that changed and with the lack of a clearness and transparency, again, of who's going to occupy the buildings and giving, you know, Brown a sweetheart, you know, lease to be the anchor tenant. And so will that produce...
Just for correction, we only think it's a sweetheart lease. They won't share the lease with us.
Well, if it's no, you heard about ducks, didn't you?
Yeah,
if it walks like a duck, you know.
Right.
But that's a good example of those points I made previous. And so, you know, that's the question. You know, why did we subsidize the building of 4 hotels? What's our game plan? You know, what do we want to invest in? Offices, hotels? Who's going to occupy those? So we're investing a lot. There'll be some construction activity, but will there be sustainable, good jobs in those buildings? You know, we don't know. Now, the other side of the coin, and I think this is something that, because of expectations, the effectiveness or the lack of effectiveness of a governor's economic strategy is often not well understood or known until long after the governor leaves office.
Yeah.
And the example I like to use is in North Carolina, the famed Triangle Park. You know, when the Carolinas set that up, they had about 200 people working there. 2 decades later, there was 10,000. And I think I read recently that now there are about 50,000 people with jobs at the Triangle.
And it is now one of the most important economic regions in America.
Right, but they had a strategy.
Right.
And the strategy wasn't to build office buildings and hotels. And I'll just make one other point, because we published this and you had a paper we wrote. When you look at where we're investing on money, there's a disproportionate amount going to real estate versus innovation initiatives.
Yeah.
And I think those are the kinds of things that somebody needs to look at. I mean, I don't trust or any agency to do an independent evaluation. The governor has been just spinning what they've been doing. So somebody needs to get in there with good oversight and say, yeah, they're making wise decisions. No, they're not making wise decisions. Or it ought to be fine-tuned, you know, what they're doing. And we can't answer those questions because, in effect, you know, we've created a quasi-independent agency that is not fully in the view of the public. And,
right.
and I haven't attended any of their board meetings, but I wonder how much their board is involved in some of those decisions. And I'm not suggesting they are or they're not a rubber stamp, but I think those are the kinds of questions that need to really be addressed.
Well, I think we all know that when somebody gets appointed by a governor to a board, there's a expectation that that board member is going to be supportive in a macro sense of the agenda that individual is trying to push forward. And you know, I think we cover those meetings on a regular basis. I think we're sometimes surprised, reporters here are sometimes surprised going over there, that on some of the questionable ones that seem to have some controversy to them, they still get approved unanimously almost every single time.
Now, there's a difference, and this is what we make the mistake. We create quasi-independent agencies because we want to create a little bit of a firewall between, you know, outright politics. Now, you're right. Anyone appointed to those boards, you know, has a certain loyalty to the person appointing. But because you're loyal to that person doesn't mean you leave your brain at the door. and the service that you can do in a loyal sense, really in the best sense of being loyal, is to look a speaker, a governor, or a president in the face and say, that's the stupidest damn decision I've ever seen. And that will be much more, not just service to the public and your fiduciary responsibility, but it'll be more of a political loyalty than being some kind of dumb rubber stamp.
I once, a mayor used to ask me to be on boards and commissions regularly, and finally she, pretty much giving it away, asked me to be on one, and it was the investment commission, and to chair it. And I said, well, kind of one ground rule is, you can't tell me how to vote. She said, never mind. Which I always thought blatant honesty in that factor.
But that's why you get these, accomplished people with resumes to be on these boards, because you want their independent judgment. And when you make it uncomfortable for them to give their independent judgments, you have 38 studios.
Yeah. And that was about as strong a board as
Kucheri did a great job on that board.
Yeah.
I was in the Kucheri administration at the time.
CEO of most of the major corporations.
Labor leaders, CEOs. And so that's a good case in point, that you want to appoint strong people, and even though they feel a sense of loyalty, their loyalty is to
Rhode Island.
To giving you good advice.
Yeah.
Giving you good advice is first.
Okay, so the budget has some complexities. We talked a little bit about last week about strategy. What's the Rhode Island strategy? Does this budget do anything to clarify the Rhode Island forward strategy, or does it only go to muddy the strategy?
It doesn't muddy it, but it doesn't clarify it either. There are several things in the budget that could potentially have some kind of strategic impact. The car tax.
Yeah.
So if 6 years from now we're spending $221 million on lowering the property tax by 9 or 10%, that is a strategy, and Rhode Island's property taxes are some
Let me ask you a question. Is the speaker not getting enough credit for making that change? This is probably, if it comes to fruition, if all 6 years pan out the way it is modeled right now, is this one of the biggest tax policy changes ever in the state of Rhode
I
Island?
don't know, biggest ever. I think, restructuring the income tax and doing some of the other things were more significant. But,
It's right up there.
To give the speaker credit, he had a tough campaign.
Yep. Made a big promise.
He made a big promise, and he's fulfilling that promise. We'll see if he can stay the course, but at least he's taking...
So like Babe Ruth at the little boys' hospital room, and
pointing to
I'm going to hit a home run for you, little Johnny?
The speaker's still in the batter's box because it'd take him 6 years to hit the home run.
Yeah, that's right. Will that be his rationale as to why he needs to be reelected every year?
Maybe. But I think that's that has...
Did I say 6? I meant 8.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, at least it doesn't eliminate. Yeah, that was a major decision, and it was a strategy to reduce the tax. There's another strategy too that people haven't spoken about, and I think this is why some of the people on the left are so upset about it. By taking that $221 million off the table, you effectively said, unless the economy grows much quicker than we anticipate it will grow, we're not going to be able to feed the beast.
Yeah.
And I think that's an implied strategy, because a lot of us have been concerned for a long time about whether or not we're spending too much, whether we're getting the biggest bang for the buck. And what the speaker's basically saying is, I'm going to give the bang for the buck back to the guy driving cars, as opposed to the guy working in Smith Street.
I do have to say about the regressiveness of the auto tax that there probably is going to be a bigger boon to spending by consumers than might be anticipated, because almost every dollar that's going to be saved on that tax is going to go back into, a lot of lower income folks are going to be able to turn that right around and spend it on a new couch, a new TV, a new car, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I don't know.
And I'll also say, I think it's going to take away the fear from many people in Rhode Island of buying a new car.
Well, I think, and I don't know if this was actually done or not, but when you make a big tax change like this, it's always helpful to have some kind of econometric forecast.
Yeah.
And even though you don't use the econometric forecast for budgeting, it will let you look at some of the dynamic factors.
I don't believe such has been done.
Well, that's unfortunate, because when you spend $221 million, it's probably good to have some estimate that will affect the economy, because right now, you and I are just speculating. And we have a Department of Revenue who's very capable of doing that.
It was an interesting process when we asked for the consulting spends over the past few years at Commerce, it might have been as if we had asked for their DNA analysis for each of them. There was just really, did not appear to be any thought process about selecting vendors that were from Rhode Island versus elsewhere. Rhode Island's one of only 3 states that in the procurement process does not give a weighting to the in-state competitor. And not only are we one of 3 states, then we're at a competitive disadvantage when Rhode Island companies go to compete in 47 other states for business in those states with state and local government.
Well, there's 2 questions there. One, I got mixed feelings, but I have kind of a non-traditional view. But the first question, we've talked about on and on and on. If you have an agency that operates in the shadows,
Yeah.
then there's less sunlight, and it's easier to make those kinds of decisions. If you operate in the sunlight, then you're a little more cognizant of giving a contract to some company in Sweden. On the question of buying Rhode Island, that's always a tough question, because your first priority, should be to get the best deal for the taxpayer. And if you can get the best deal from the taxpayer, from a Rhode Island company, then that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But if you can't, then you have to look outside the state.
Okay, so budget, are we gonna see any changes as it goes to the House floor?
In 40 years, I think I've seen 3 changes, and I don't see what the public, it's early, and I don't know what the amendments are, but I haven't heard a great public outcry about this budget.
And it gets adopted in about a week, and then we're done for the session.
Well,
we don't have a lot else
They're
pending.
I don't know what their deals are up there, but they always find ways to trade things and prolong the session. So it'll be probably a week after the budget's adopted.
Hawsocks are off the table. Superman building, at least till the fall.
Yeah.
Superman building never really got on the table. Is there any chance for any last-second big amendment to make some big noise?
I don't know, because I've been spending more time 400 miles south of here than here. But I look at it across the street, the Superman building. What do you do with that? It's just such an inefficient plant for the world today.
It could be a spectacular headquarters for the Hassenfeld Institute of
we have a decent endowment, but not that decent.
not big enough to take on the 400,000 square feet of.
We like the bucolic atmosphere of Brian Captain Smithfield. That was good.
Now, we just briefly talked about the college program that had been proposed by the governor. It went from being at URI, RIC, and CCRI. It was big, it was bold, it was #1 in the country, it was $30 million, and it got narrowed down to a $3 million program functionally for CCRI students. Still no means testing, which seems just bizarre.
I don't understand that. I don't know why you wouldn't means test it, so I can't answer that question. I don't know what research was done. If they looked at the demography of who was applying and whether it was necessary or not.
Yeah.
Common sense would say you means tested it. Common sense would really ask the question, is 2.5 grade point average, sufficiently rigorous enough? But now it's a $3 million program, so let's give it a chance and see what needs to be done. I view it, and this may be polyandrous, as a starting point. We're going to invest $3 million in giving free tuition to community college. And I hope there's a good evaluation, done independent of the governor's office or with the governor's office, but not from the governor's office, on what it accomplishes, what kind of unintended consequences does it have, and maybe hopefully move forward from there if it can be fixed. So I view it as a pilot project. I view it as an experiment. I don't think $3 million is a princely sum not to use for an experiment.
Okay, last thing. Federal, what we should be looking for?
The rosary, I guess.
Healthcare and the budget. Let's hit on both those real quick.
Well, the budget's not very popular with either Democrat or Republicans up there, and there's a real dilemma because if it's not the president's budget, which I don't believe it will be, is how are the Republicans going to put together a budget? And if they want to use reconciliation, they have to put together a budget, or everything becomes, very stalemated, up there. And there's no clear path. On Medicaid, I I'm not optimistic, but I'm not as pessimistic as some. I think, Mitch McConnell is a wily old guy.
Yeah.
I think they've identified the issues. I think I can see a way out to compromising on Medicaid between the states that expanded and the states that chose, not to, by, having the phase out run 7 or 10 years. We spoke about that before. And then it gets down to a question of how you handle pre-existing conditions. That is doable. They're not saying it will be done. It's hard. I don't think it'll be done with the schedule. They promised by July 4th. I see that as a real challenge, particularly with the resistance that's going to come from the Democrat Party, in the Senate. But once that passes, there's a lot of uncertainty of what happens with the House. Again, looking at it with the glass being half full and not half empty, Republicans promised to repeal and replace Obamacare. And at some point, they're going to need to come to Jesus meeting to say, okay, this is not how I would have repealed and replaced, but if I don't come home with nothing, then the kids are not going to eat. It's like the guy that works at the factory, and they cut his wage. He didn't quit working at the factory. The kids had stuff to eat. And so I think McConnell has some tricks up his sleeve. I think they're making progress on those two issues. They're not there yet. They're not going to meet their schedule. And at the end of the day, it's either going to be the embarrassment of doing nothing or the embarrassment of really getting a half a load.
I lied to you. I said those were the last two. I got one more for you. Infrastructure. It seems perplexing that a newly elected president like Trump, who has, gotten a lot of support from the idea, on both sides of the aisle for the most part, on pushing forward a major infrastructure bill, seems fairly nowhere on putting forth a significant, it put a lot of people to work, and it would kind of build on his populist popularity, if there's much of that left, but it might re-energize it and also show he's a doer rather than a tweeter.
Well,
yeah.
I'd like to see him tweet about the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's right.
There's both political and substantive issues. On the political side, Democrats don't want to work, with the president. He can come up with King Midas's plan to make gold. I'm not sure they want to work, with him. Also, on the political side, there are a lot of undersecretary and top-level positions that haven't been filled.
No, I know, it's really remarkable.
And how the administration, operates with that expertise is a real challenge. So you have those two challenges, one political, one administrative, before you get to the substantive questions. On the substantive question, there's a real issue. To say you have an infrastructure bill that relies as much on fees and on private-public partnerships is not a comprehensive infrastructure bill.
Yeah.
There are certain issues, where private-public partnerships and fee financing is totally appropriate. Airports, in some places, toll roads. But in other places, you need public investment. You need public dollars, whether it's increasing the gasoline tax, reallocating. And keep in mind that the federal government doesn't have a capital budget.
Yeah.
So they can't go out and just sell bonds the way a state could and finance a project over a period of time. So I think there's a substantive question of how you finance and what part of infrastructure should be given a priority. And then there are the political administrative issues that we discussed.
Moneyman, your reach is not only political and economic, it goes, in all directions. Your prediction, will Bob Flanders run for I believe I read about that, a big fundraiser.
So I'm not going to talk for Bob Flanders, but I think he'd make an excellent candidate.
He would make an excellent candidate. What will be served? Do we have the menu yet on?
No, I'm not. They don't want me. I'm not allowed in the kitchen. Okay?
Is this just going to be Cheese Whiz on Ritz crackers, or are we going to go Triscuits and cheddar?
It's the 24th. You'll come, you'll find out.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, sir.
The Money Man, Gary Sasse, as always, a bastion of information and a predictor of just about everything.